So hello and welcome to this course, NPTEL course entitled 20th-Century Fiction. And in this particular lecture, we'll start with what is the first text in this course, which is Rabindranath Tagore's short story, The Postmaster. So we'll start with this text, but it's important, as always, to give a background to the cultural conditions that we will see in this text. So this is obviously written in the time of this is colonial Bengal under the British rule, and the post office becomes a very symbolic space in this particular story. And a postmaster, of course, is a professional, but we'll see how the professional persona and the personal persona, the existential persona, are dialoguing with each other in this particular story. So the backdrop is colonial Bengal, and the post office and the postmaster are obviously symbolic functions of that colonial machinery. But inside this colonial machinery, we find a very human short story, a very human tale, a very human experience, which is captured in this particular story. There's also the very symbolic presence of the indigo plantation, the indigo factory, which is again a very, very colonial machinery, because the entire idea of the indigo was to produce a certain crop, a certain product, a certain commodity, which is quite colonial in quality, and that indigo would obviously be transported away to the industries in England. So the post office and the indigo plantation are very, very interestingly placed apropos of one another in this massive colonial machinery that we see in the story. And the postmaster becomes a very symbolic presence in this story. As I mentioned, he's a colonial servant, he's a servant, a functionary inside the colonial machinery, but equally this is a story about memory, this is a story about human emotions, this is a story about gender, because we do find a very interesting relationship which grows, which brews between the postmaster, this young man, and it's a very, very small girl who does all jobs for him, Ratan, in this particular story. And Ratan is obviously a village girl, a rural girl, illiterate, and she's taught by the postmaster, and they begin to form a human bond, which is very tragically truncated at the end of the story. So there are lots of issues we'll touch upon as we move on, but these are some of the general broad-brushed themes that we'll keep coming back to: the colonial machinery, the postmaster as a white-collar servant in the colonial machinery, and it's very interesting gender perspective that we see in this particular story, and also the symbolic sites, the post office and the indigo plantation, the indigo factory that we see in the story. And the other thing that we'll touch upon a little bit is the relationship or the contrast that is shown between the city and the country. Because we are told that a postmaster is a Calcutta person, is a person in the colonial capital, Calcutta, and he obviously has an urban background, he has an urban mind, he has an urban set of habits which are completely non-synchronous or incongruous with the rural setting in which the story is described, which is that of Ullapoor, the village called Ullapoor, which is where the story takes place. So let's dive into the story and see what takes place in this short story called The Postmaster by Rabindranath Tagore, which we're obviously reading in translation. So the postmaster, this should be on the screen now. The postmaster first took up his duties in the village of Ullapoor. Though the village was a small one, there was an indigo factory nearby, and the proprietor, an Englishman, had managed to get a post office established. So we see immediately how the colonial presence, the colonial condition, the colonial culture is established in the very inception of the story, that we are told is the village called Ullapoor. And although the village was a small one, there was an indigo factory, and the indigo factory becomes a very symbolic site of colonial control, of colonial production, colonial industrial production. And of course, with the colonial production, there needs to be this entire administrative network around it, the bureaucratic network around it, the information network around it. And the post office at that time, this is obviously pre-email, pre-anything that we know today as technology. The post office over here becomes the very symbolic site through which the colonial control is exerted and consolidated, because the post office becomes the site of information exchange. So on one hand, we have the indigo factory as a site of production, and the post office over here as a site of dissemination, right? So dissemination of information related to presumably the production politics, the production control, the production reports of this particular indigo factory, right? And we are also told immediately that the proprietor happens to be an Englishman, who is obviously a colonial person in control of this indigo factory, who owns the indigo factory. Okay. Our postmaster belonged to Calcutta, and as is mentioned, this is also a story about the tension or the contradiction in culture and mindset between a city mind and a rural mind, and we've shown the binary in very interesting terms. He felt like a fish out of water in his remote village. His office and living room were in the dark thatched shed, not far from a green slimy pond, surrounded by on all sides by a dense growth. So we have a very, very thick rural setting over here. We're told that his office and his living room are part of a dark thatched shed, and there's a pond nearby, and there's a dense forest around the pond and the office, which is obviously very different, presumably, from the kind of conditions that he's habituated to, he's used to in Calcutta. So we're told he felt like a fish out of water, which is to say, he felt completely out of his comfort zone. He felt very, very like a misfit in this particular setting. The men employed in the indigo factory had no leisure. Moreover, they were hardly desirable companions for decent folk. So the laborers in the indigo factory, we are made to told that we are told that they had no leisure, which is to say that they were obviously overwrought. And one of the things which you'll find in this particular story, written by Tagore, is that very characteristically he gives a lot of hints, a lot of suggestions in terms of what is really going on without spelling it out. So we get a sense of how the indigo factory over here is essentially a site of exploitation. It's essentially a site of unregulated production, unregulated labor, and they had no leisure. The laborers had no leisure whatsoever, and this is complete exploitation, complete unregulated exploitation, unregulated production, unregulated control of work, as we are told. So the men employed in the factory had no leisure. Moreover, they were hardly desirable companions for decent folk. Right. So the whole idea of the decent folk, or the Bengali term for that is Bhadralok, which is the gentleman, the genteel person who's educated, presumably has had English education, etc. So those of us interested in the history of colonial education would know that the entire idea of educating the Indians, especially in the presidency towns like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, was intended to create this generation of Indians who would be a very, very handy and convenient go-between between the colonial machinery and the colonized natives. So people who know English, people who know a basic amount of education, according to the Western education template, in order to carry out the machinery of colonialism more effectively, right? So, and obviously the inception of that particular enterprise began to happen, had its point of origin from the Macmillan Minutes of Education, 1835, as some of you would know. That entire Minutes of Education by Lord Macaulay in the British Parliament in 1835 was to propose a bill wherein Indians would be educated, Indians would be given Western education, English education, primarily to produce a generation of people, a generation of Indians who would be Indians in colour, according to Macaulay, but British in taste and temperament and education. And there would be a very, very handy buffer, so to say, between the colonial machinery, the colonial master, and the colonial servant, the colonial subject. So the Bengali person over here, the Bhadralok, decent gentleman over here, he happens to be a very direct product, a very direct progeny of that enterprise, that exercise, that experiment of Macmillan education, Macmillan Minutes on Indian education. So he gets a job as a postmaster in a British post office, set in India, of course. But the entire purpose of the post office, we are told, is to be the information center, the information point around the indigo factory. So we see, as I mentioned already, how the indigo factory and the post office are all very colonial positions, very colonial sites, and the man over here who's just joined the job as a postmaster is very much part of the payroll of the colonial machinery. Okay, so we are told that the indigo factory workers have no leisure, and they're not really the decent folk, they're not really the Bhadraloks or the gentlemen with whom the Calcutta person would have a normal, cultured, cultivated conversation. Nor is the Calcutta boy an adept in the art of associating with others. Among strangers he appears either proud or ill at ease. At any rate, the postmaster had but little company, nor had he much to do. So he was stationed, he was positioned in a place which is very far away from anything he knows, doesn't have any company, doesn't have any society, and we are told he gets more and more alienated. So we have a sense of the alienation of the worker over here. And it's very interestingly comparable to the fact that the indigo factory workers had no leisure at all. So there too there's a degree of alienation in more Marxist terms, and over here we have an alienation in the sense of more existential terms. Okay, so that the two kinds of alienation are interestingly dialoguing with each other over here. At times he tried his hand at writing a verse or two, that the movement of the leaves and the clouds of the sky were enough to fill life with joy. Such were the sentiments to which he sought to give expression. But God knows that a poor fellow would have felt it as a gift of a new life if some genie of the Arabian Nights had in one night swept away all the trees, the leaves and all, and replaced them with magnetized road, hiding the clouds in view with rows of tall houses. So we have a sense of very tongue-in-cheek humor that Tagore very characteristically depicts in almost all his short fiction coming out here as well. So we see that the Postmaster, because he had a lot of time in his hand, he had almost nothing to do, he had no society to converse with, so he tried his hand in writing verse. Again, this is something that is told that he would do as a man of culture and a man of cultivation. And then we are told that what were the themes that he wanted to write on, and the themes were obviously nature, the movement of the leaves and the clouds of the sky, and those things filling his life with joy. Such were the sentiments to which he sought to give expression. So he wanted to give expression to those sentiments. Looking around him, you can just see trees and breeze and sky. But we are told immediately after that, actually, in his own heart, he hated this place. He would have been very, very happy if all the trees and leaves were taken away by some genie of Arabian Nights. And this allusion, this reference is very interesting, because the genie of Arabian Nights, as we are told, is the archetypal desire machine. So he's someone who can get your job done, whatever you desire, whatever you wish for, he can make that happen, he can materialize it. And that's an interesting presence in this particular short story, because we are told that he's very, very unhappy in his job. He's very unhappy as a person in the British payroll, working in a very, very alienated and lonely post office in the middle of this place called Udaipur, and he's trying to write poetry, he's trying to write short fiction based on his experiences with nature, but then in his heart he hates everything, and he longs for things such as macadamized road, which is to say, roads which are built with proper cement, roads which are built with proper tar, etc., or pakka road, as the British would say it, and then rows of tall houses. So he's more keen, is more habituated, is more attuned or aligned to seeing pakka houses, macadamized roads, and tall houses, rather than seeing trees and nature and rivers and skies around him. So although he wanted to write about those things, about natural settings, about the beauty of nature, he couldn't get around to doing it, because in his heart he never really related to it, right? He related only to more urban settings. So we have this town versus or village, country versus city tension creeping in already in the story, because we're told this is a person who's very much a city person, and he feels completely out of place, fish out of water, we are told, when he's stationed almost tragically at his post office in the middle of this place called Udaipur, which is a village in the middle of nowhere, and doesn't have any company, doesn't have any society, doesn't have any recreation or any work for the matter, right? And he tries his hand in writing poetry, seeking to draw inspiration from the natural beauty around him, but in his heart he's completely cut off from any understanding of nature, and he's longing to see macadamized roads and tall buildings instead of leaves and clouds and skies, for the matter. Okay, so the postmaster's salary was small. He had to cook his own meals, which he used to share with Ratan, an orphan girl of the village who did all jobs for him. So we're introduced to the character called Ratan, who we're told is an orphan girl of the village who would just do this errand jobs for him. And the postmaster's salary was not very, nothing to write home about. It was a very modest salary, and he had to cook his own meals because he couldn't hire a person who could cook his meals for him. And then he would share the meals with a girl called Ratan, who was an orphan girl of the village, who did all jobs with him. Now, for him. So from this point in time in the story, we have this relationship between the postmaster and Ratan described to us in very, very aesthetic terms, and we are told how they almost, there's this very interesting parental relationship that they managed to construct. So on the one hand, the postmaster becomes a sort of a father figure for Ratan, and then we also told that in the course of the story, when the postmaster falls sick, Ratan heals him back to health. And so she becomes the mother figure at that point in time. So this entire politics and performance of parenting is very interestingly, very complexly depicted and described in this particular section. And they sort of parent each other in very, very complex ways and very existentially enriching ways, right? And therein lies the bond that is shared in the course of the story. When in the evening the smoke began to curl up from the village cowsheds, and the cicadas chirped in every bush, when the mendicants of the Baul sect sang their shrill songs in a daily meeting place, when any poet who had attempted to watch the movement of the leaves in a dense bamboo thickets would have felt a ghostly shiver run down his back, the postmaster would light this little lamp and call out Ratan. Now, if you take a look at the descriptions over here, cicadas chirping in every bush, Baul songs sang in daily meeting places. Baul songs are the rural folk songs which are sung in rural Bengal. They can be religious in quality, but they also carry a lot of community message. So the Baul songs tell a lot about community, about the conditions of life, about the conditions of dailiness, which is sometimes couched in religious metaphors or mystic metaphors. But Baul songs are very symbolic of rural Bengal. So that particular symbolic presence is there to describe the ruralness of this particular setting. And we also told that any poet who attempted to watch the movement of the leaves in the dense bamboo thickets would feel a shiver run down his back. So there's something almost ghostly about how lonely this place is, how alienated this place is. And the ghostliness is something which is described in rural terms. And when this particular twilight moment happens every day, when the birds come back and smoke begins to curl from the village cow sheds, which is say that it's probably people are cooking their evening meals, or maybe they're burning dung, and there are Baul songs which are sung at the end of the day. And when any poet, presumably an urban poet who wants to write about nature, will actually feel a shiver run down his spine, looking at the or hearing the rustle of the leaves in dense bamboo thickets. At this time every day, the postmaster would light his little lamp during twilight and call out Ratan. Ratan would sit outside waiting for this call, and instead of coming in at once, would reply, "Did you call me, sir?" "What are you doing?" the postmaster would ask. "I must be going to light the kitchen fire." So the kitchen fire over here is the earthenware oven, which would be used with coal. So the whole point was to put the coal on fire, which would create this temperature inside the earthenware oven on which you can cook your meals, right? So this is again a very typical object in rural Bengal, the earthenware oven, and Ratan's job would be to set fire to the coals in order to warm up or heat up the earthenware oven, which would be used in turn to cook meals for the postmaster. So I must be going to light the kitchen fire would be the answer, and the postmaster would say, "Oh, let the kitchen fire be for a while, light me my pipe first." So the pipe would be a cigarette, so not exactly cigarette in the British sense, but tobacco rolled into a leaf-like thing, which is again something which the rural people would smoke. But the pipe could also be a metaphor of urbanity over here, so we're not quite sure what pipe has been talked about. It could be an urban metaphor, an urban signifier, the pipe smoked by the city people. We're not entirely sure, because we also told the postmaster's salary was very modest, so affording a pipe. So pipe is normally a signifier of the colonial masculinity, as someone who is obviously positioned in the position of prestige, in a side of prestige, in a side of privilege. But we're not quite sure. But the point is, the postmaster over here, he would more often than not ask Ratan to light up the pipe instead of the kitchen fire, which is to say he's not really keen on his meals. It's not really related or connected to his meals, because there's no sense of home that he has in this particular setting. So he would just while away his time smoking his pipe. So this particular preference is important. The preference for the pipe rather than the kitchen fire would indicate that the postmaster over here looks at this place as more of a place of leisure, a place of inaction, a place where he has a kill time, rather than a place of nourishment, because the entire idea, the entire metaphor of the kitchen fire can be seen as a symbol of nourishment, a symbol of homely, intimate nourishment, which he doesn't want. Rather, he wants to light the pipe and smoke a pipe, and that's what he instructs Ratan to do. At last, Ratan would enter, and with puffed up cheeks, vigorously blowing into a flame a live coal to light the tobacco. This would give the postmaster an opportunity of conversing. So the whole idea of the opportunity of conversing is important, because we are told at the beginning of the story that he doesn't really get a chance to converse with people on his own equal wavelength, because he can't converse with the factory workers, and obviously can't converse with the British proprietor of the factory. So he's completely alone. So he ends up talking to this girl called Ratan, who did odd jobs for him. "Well, Ratan, perhaps you'll begin. Do you remember anything of your mother?" That was a fertile subject. Ratan partly remembered and partly did not. Her father had been fonder of her than her mother. Him she recollected more vividly. He used to come home in the evening after his work, and one or two evenings stood out more clearly than others. Like pictures in a memory, Ratan would sit on the floor near the postmaster's feet as memories crowded in upon her. So the whole idea of memory coming back, this is a very, almost a Wordsworthian kind of a setting, where there are two people, two human subjects who otherwise are not occupied with anything. They recollect emotions and tranquility. And then the question about his father or mother would remind Ratan of the many memories she had with the father, and she would narrate those to the postmaster, and that's the way they would pass time every evening. So Ratan would sit on the floor near the postmaster's feet as memories crowded in upon her. She called to mind a little brother that she had, and on some bygone cloudy day she had played at fishing with him on the edge of the pond with a twig for a make-believe fishing rod. So again, the whole idea of a make-believe game with a brother, we don't know what's wrong with him. Maybe, at this point we can't guess, but there's a very strong hint, a very strong suggestion. Maybe they're all dead. Maybe they died of poverty. Maybe they died of a disease, and maybe they died by not being, nourished enough. We don't know. But she recollects these events in a very, very flashback kind of way, in a very flashy way. Some images come back to her with some flashy vigor, and she narrates those to the postmaster as when those come back. Such little incidents would drive out greater events from her mind. Thus as they talked, it would often get very late, and the postmaster would feel too lazy to do any cooking at all. Ratan would then hastily light the fire to toast some unleavened bread, which, with the cold remnants of the morning meal, was enough for their supper. So this is what I meant earlier when I said that the postmaster doesn't really feel connected to this place as a home, so he doesn't really think of cooking a meal, which would be symbolic of a home, a homely meal, but rather he's more keen on passing time with a conversation. So he smokes his tobacco, he smokes his pipe, and listens to Ratan talking about her father and her family, and in the end, when it'll get very, very late, he'll just make some bread. Some unleavened bread, we're told, which they'll have for supper, with the cold remnants of a morning meal. So there is a degree of staleness about this existence that we can see with the reputation of the food. It's not really fresh food, it's not really warm food. The lack of warmth, the lack of freshness is something that we see quite palpably present in this particular setting. On some evenings, seated at the desk in a corner of his big empty shed, the postmaster too would call up memories of his own home, of his mother and his sister, of those for whom in his exile his heart was sad. Memories which were always home to him, but which he could not talk about with the men of the factory, though he found himself naturally recalling them aloud in the presence of a simple little girl. So interestingly, we find that the postmaster connects much better, much more organically to little girl Ratan over here than to the man of the factory. So there's a degree of cultural gap over here, presumably, that he cannot recollect, he cannot narrate, he cannot share his recollections with the men of the factory, although they're men, so there's gender affinity that he presumably has to them, but there's this wavelength mismatch which causes him not to confide to them, but on the other hand, talk to the little girl in terms of telling her about his memories, memories of his home, his mother, and his sister. Okay. So it came about that a girl would allude to his people as mother, brother, and sister, as if she had known them all her life. In fact, she had a complete picture of each one of them painted in a little heart. So this is very, very interesting, how kinship is established through memory, or how kinship is established through recollection of memory. So the postmaster would recollect memories, or narrate memories of his mother, sister, and presumably other members of the family to the little girl, and also his brother. And he would tell more and more stories every single day, till the point came that a little girl, Ratan, imagined herself to be part of the family. So we can see again, this is what I remember, I say kinship is established, generated through storytelling in this particular section. Storytelling or consuming stories makes you akin to the characters in the story. It makes you somehow related organically, existentially, emotionally with the characters in the story, right? So this is a very, very interesting little image that Tagore is creating over here. And if you visualize it, a little girl listening to stories told by an older man who's very lonely, very sad, and he's telling her stories about his family, his relatives, his brother, his sister, his mother, and she's consuming all the stories with great delight, to the point that she finds herself planted in that particular setting. She finds herself situated in that particular setting as part of the family of the postmaster. It's a very, very organic kind of a consumption of stories, or organic consumption of memory, so to say. One noon, during a break in the rains, there was a cool, soft breeze blowing. The smell of the damp grass and leaves in the hot sun felt like the warm breathing of the tired earth on one's body. A persistent bird went on all the afternoon, repeating the burden of his own complaint in nature's audience chamber. So again, the natural descriptions are very, very evocative in quality. We are told that there's this cool breeze which is coming after a rain, and there's the sound of a bird which is calling all afternoon, repeating the burden of his one complaint in nature's audience chamber. So, there's a lot of dialogic description over here. The little bird talking to the nature, the rain falling on earth, all very dialogic entanglement, very organic entanglement between or across different natural signifiers. The Postmaster had nothing to do. The shimmer of the freshly washed leaves, the banked up remnants of the retreating rain clouds were sights to see, and the Postmaster was watching them and thinking to himself, oh, if only some kindred soul were near, just one loving human being whom I could hold near my heart. This was exactly, he went on to think, what the bird was trying to say, and it was the same feeling that which the murmuring leaves were trying to express, was striving to express. So look at the way in which he establishes a dialogue with the natural objects around him, the bird. So he's sort of guessing that the bird is probably trying to tell about loneliness, is probably trying to listen or sing about loneliness and alienation. The same with the leaves. Maybe the murmuring leaves were trying to express, that if only this wish of having a companion to talk to, a human companion that would be an interlocutor of his experience, of his memories, right? So that kind of a wish for an interlocutor, that wish for someone to listen to his particular story is something which the Postmaster is projecting onto the natural elements around him. So this is a very classic case of projection of loneliness, a projection of a wish fulfillment. And he's sort of thinking that a little bird chirping away to nature is probably talking about his loneliness, and the rustling leaves talking the rain on the earth are probably also talking about his loneliness. So it's all getting projected in a very, very organic, natural kind of way. But no one knows or would believe that such an idea might also take possession of an ill-paid village postmaster in the deep, silent midday interval of his work. The postmaster sighed and called out Ratan. Ratan was sprawling beneath the guava tree, busily engaged in eating unripe guavas. Again, a very, very rural signifier. Someone sitting under guava trees and eating unripe guavas. The unripe thing is interesting over here because that's it's more rural in quality, whereas a ripe guava, which is more consumerist, which is bought in the market, it's more commonly urban in quality, right? So this image of this girl sitting beneath a guava tree eating unripe guavas is a very rural image, a very idyllic rural image, so to say. So Ratan was sprawling beneath the guava tree, busily engaged in eating unripe guavas. At the voice of her master, she ran up breathlessly, saying, "What are you calling me, Dada?" "I was thinking," said the Postmaster, "of teaching you to read." And then for the rest of the afternoon, he taught her the alphabet. So again, notice the transition from Sir to Dada, right? Dada is elder brother in Bengali. So, that address of Dada or elder brother to the Postmaster, it suggests a sense of intimacy, existential, emotional intimacy that she's beginning to brew with the Postmaster, and that's something that she's addressing him with. And then, she's told that the Postmaster wishes to teach them how to read, so, they'll start with the alphabets. Thus, in a very short time, Ratan had got as far as a double consonant, so she could read compound consonants, so double consonants. So she was progressing, and obviously she was very quick-witted, she was a very clever and keen student of the Postmaster. It seemed as though the showers of the season would never end. Canals, ditches, and hollows were all overflowing with water. So there was overabundance of rainfall, which is creating trouble for everyone around over here because everything was getting flooded, everything was getting spilled over with water. Day and night, the patter of rain was heard and the croaking of frogs. The village roads became impassable, and marketing had to be done in punts. So, the whole idea of going out to shop something was almost unthinkable. So it had to be done in different phases whenever there was, the village roads were traversable or passable, because most of the time they were impassable because of the rain. One heavily clouded morning, the Postmaster's little pupil had been long waiting outside the door for her call, but on not hearing it as usual, she took up a dog-eared book and slowly entered the room. So we told her Ratan would sit outside the room every single morning, waiting to be called in and then waiting to be taught by the Postmaster. But at that particular morning, she wasn't being called, so she was sitting outside very patiently. But then when the call never came, she walked in and slowly entered the room. She found the master stretched out on his bed, and thinking that he was resting, she was about to retire on tiptoe when she suddenly heard her name. "Ratan." She turned at once and asked, "Where are you sleeping, Dada?" The Postmaster in a plaintive voice said, "I'm not well. Feel my head. Is it very hot?" So this is a fever in the story, which becomes a very symbolic condition, because we find that the entire idea of fever, where the postmaster becomes sick and unwell, it reverses the parental politics in the story, because Ratan then becomes a caregiver. Ratan becomes, from this point, the mother figure in the story, as opposed to how the postmaster had been parenting her through education, right? So on the one hand, we have parenting through education. On the other hand, we have parenting through caregiving, right? So, and both become very interestingly prominent in this short story. So the postmaster is coming down with a fever and is asking Ratan to check his temperature by just feeling it, but just touching his forehead. In the loneliness of his exile and in the gloom of the rains, his ailing body needed a little tender nursing. So it longed for human contact, for human compassion. He longed to remember the touch of the forehead, of soft hands with tinkling bracelets, to imagine the presence of loving womanhood, the nearness of mother and sister. So he's remembering the tinkling bracelets on the hands of the mother and sister who would touch him on the forehead when he was unwell. So those fond memories, those tactile memories keep coming back over here, and he's longing to enjoy or to have the presence of loving womanhood, nurturing womanhood, right? So caregiving womanhood. The nearness of mother and sister. An exile was not disappointed. Ratan ceased to be a little girl. She at once stepped into the post of mother, called in a village doctor, gave the patient his pills at the proper intervals, sat up all night by his pillars, cooked the gruel for him, and every now and then asked, "Are you feeling a little better now, Dada?" So look at the caregiving that Ratan does over here. So she's called the village doctor comes in, so she's also a very good presence of mind, cooked his gruel for him, this food, the sick food, the comfort food for him, and every now and then would ask him, "Are you feeling a little better now, Dada?" Again, big brother. It was some time before the postmaster, with weakened body, was able to leave his sick bed. "No more of this," said he with decision. "I must get a transfer." He at once wrote off to Calcutta an application for a transfer on the grounds of the unhealthiness of the place. So we'll stop at this point today, because there's a change in direction in the story, a change in argument and sentiment in the story from this point. But what we've done so far, we can see very clearly that the fever comes in and it completely decimates the postmaster health-wise, but also demoralizes him, and it almost makes him determined to leave this place, because he decides he cannot carry on staying in this place, which is so non-conducive to his health, non-conducive to his social conditions, or his social status or intellectual status, or whatever it is. So he applies for a leave, he applies for a transfer on the grounds of the unhealthiness of the place. He writes a letter to the Calcutta, the headquarters presumably, asking or requesting a transfer. So you can look at the way in which the entire colonial machinery, especially its administrative machinery, is controlled and distributed and disseminated to the post office over here, which becomes a very important side of exchange in the colonial system. And we find from this point of the story there'll be a change in human emotions as well. There's an existential shift which will come in at this point, which we'll capture and carry on in the next lectures to come. Thank you very much for your attention.